Hi folks, with Tacitus today, your pushback channel. Thank you for joining this audio live stream. Please listen to this presentation as you would a radio broadcast. In this essay, I'd like to talk about all across the Western world, this is happening by the way, the rental affordability crisis or mortgage affordability, doesn't matter. I'll focus on rents for the purpose of this essay. Now, there's not the problem is unacknowledged. I think it's a couple of things here. It's substantially underacknowledged, and there are various statistical sort of scam methodologies the various governments are using to try and hide the true state of the affordability crisis. So they're trying to say, well, it's not really that big a deal, it's up a little bit. So they claim pretty much universally, certainly in Australia, Canada, and say Britain, that the rental affordability crisis comes along when you have to pay 30% or more of your income on rent. But even this is a scam, and I'll come back to that in a minute, and just how they play around with the numbers there and how they play around with the, is it a pre-tax income? Is it an after-tax income? Is it after-tax and Social Security? So they play, again, fast and loose here. Also, they jump around between personal income and household income to try and suggest affordability is fine, there's not a problem. But I'll just come back to the very first apartment I ever rented. And I paid, at the time it was furnished, by the way, and I paid like $20 a week back then. It was a compact one-bedroom apartment with a fairly generous sized garage, actually, and similarly a generously sized storage area. So even though the apartment was compact, and it was, the garage and storage area would sort of compensate, if you like. Also, it had like a linen closet there for putting in things like sheets and towels and whatever. That was also quite generously sized. Now, at the time, I'll just use round numbers here, but at the time, the average income after tax and after any deductions was $100 a week. About $105 a week at the time, and the rent was $20. And again, it was furnished, so like you got a refrigerator and a dining table and chairs and a couple of other little things that were the sort of minimum necessities, I guess. Had an oven and all that, of course, there. So anyway, so it's 20% of the average wage. This is the average wage after all deductions. So now that same apartment today, it doesn't have the storage area, and it doesn't have the garage. So all you get is this compact apartment with nothing else. But it's that instead of $20 a week, it's now just over $500 a week. So the rent has increased by 26 times from what it was. Now, over that same period, depending on whose numbers you look at, our wages have increased by 10 times. Now, you can, some stats are 9 times, others, 10.5. So I'll just take 10 as an average. And that's probably a little bit generous, but just assuming that. So if the rent has increased by 25 times and the income has increased by 10 times over that period, then you're looking at the cost of, the actual cost of living type cost is 2.5 times higher than it was. Now, on top of that, the contributions to be made to Social Security and other deductions mean you actually get less income in your pocket. So we're looking at about 3 times in reality from your net, that is the cash you take home each week in your pay packet. It's like the rent is now 3 times higher than it was relative to income. So even if you have 2 incomes, like there are 2 people on the average wage living in that compact apartment, which would be a tough gig, I would think. But anyway, it could be done. My girlfriend used to come over, so it could be done. But So 3 times the cost. So even if you had two incomes, two average wage incomes, you'd still be looking at approximately 40% more expensive than it was, even with two incomes coming in. So this is on a relative basis. Now, had the rent kept pace with income, then the rent, instead of being $500 a week, would be $200 a week. So we need to understand that, we need to fully grasp that that's the extent of the inflation in rents that's occurred. And this is across the Western world. It's not just in Sydney, it's in London and elsewhere. This is the sort of inflation that's occurred. Now, this is not an inner city suburb. I wouldn't call it an outer suburb. So it's at the, if you like, the outer end of the middle distance suburbs for this. So now looking at, say, rents, like if I look at, say, a 3-bedroom freestanding brick house on with a decent sort of yard and all this sort of thing, in say a suburb that's 100 miles out of Sydney, outside of downtown Sydney, the rent in those sort of places now is between the $700 and $800 a week. Rents that were less than $100 when I was a kid. So they've gone up quite substantially as well. But if you want to rent a place that's, say, 10 miles outside of downtown Sydney, same place as the outer suburb, then you're paying $1,300 or $1,400 a week for that same place. So the rents are almost double. Now, when they're doing the stats for affordability, rental affordability, they look at, say, well, the downtown area of Sydney is the affordability is lower. But if you go into the outer suburbs and 100 miles out, the affordability is much greater. But here's the sleight of hand they use. They use the national average wage to do this. And the reality is that a job that pays, $100 a week in, I'm using round numbers here, pays $100 a week in downtown Sydney area, the CBD, that same job will only pay $60 a week if you go 100 miles outside of Sydney. So by applying the national average of the wage, they artificially weight the wage, the average wage, they artificially weight it higher, whereas the incomes are 30% or more less in those outer suburbs. So even though the rent is cheaper, the rent is less, the incomes are less. So the affordability crisis, if you like, extends much further than statistically they let on. So the other sleight of hand they use is they switch around between, they assume the household income has two incomes. That's the underlying assumption. So on that basis, they can say affordability isn't quite as bad as it really is. Not every house, the one-bedroom apartment, not everyone is, a lot of people are living on their own these days. So, particularly the one-bedroom apartments and so on. So they're living on their own. So they don't have two incomes. So really the measure of affordability is a single average wage, and then using that as the baseline over the years, going back to, 1970 or whatever, and then looking at that today. So that's what they don't do. They don't use that. They play around with the baseline. They also play around with using gross income or net income. Gross income is the income you get before any deductions such as tax, social security. Net income is the income you get after all the deductions such as tax and such as social security. So they play around, they jump around with those numbers to say, well, look, the affordability is not too bad. But to do that, they assume two incomes in the household, and then they use gross wages. That is the wages before there's any deductions such as tax and social security. But if you actually recalculate all the numbers and bring it back to the standard baseline, what is the net income? That is the cash you get after tax and social security is taken out. And then what is the average wage? And what is then the rental? And when you look at that, the affordability crisis is just off the charts. If you make the average wage, assuming you live in Sydney, and you just even if you're renting a compact one-bedroom apartment with no garage or anything else, the little shoebox is it. You're paying approximately 60% of your net income in rent. That's the reality. This idea that it's just it's 32% of your your wages, and there's only a few people are in this struggle street, so there's 32% of your wages goes. That's bullshit. And they're purposefully and willfully lying in order to make out that the problem is much less than it is. But the reality is quite, even in 100 miles outside of Sydney, in a sort of the outer suburbs, the rents say $500 a week. But if you then look at the average wage in those areas that are 100 miles out, the income is maybe 700 or 800 a week after tax. So if you're spending 500 and your total income is 700, you can't afford to run a car or anything. I mean, you're living hand to mouth, day to day. If you get sick, and a lot of these lower paid jobs, they don't have much in the way of benefits. So if somebody is sick or they can't work for a few days, then that's it. They financially hit the wall and they've got to go and borrow money from pawnbrokers or something like that. It's insane, but that's the reality where it's at. So when you look at these statistics that say, it's just a handful of people in London that can't afford to pay their rent or something like that, or they're struggling because the rent's gone over 30% of their income, that's absolute crap. They're assuming gross income, again, before any deductions such as tax, and they're assuming a double income household rather than a single income. Now, if you look at all the households certainly around Australia, I think it was the last one was like 27% are living on their own. Now, and if you look at assuming they have, again, that they're on the average wage renting a small compact apartment, then they'd all be struggling. They'd all be spending 60% of their income on the rent, on the weekly rent. But this is neatly avoided. The extent of the crisis is neatly avoided by, again, scamming the numbers, as I've mentioned in this essay. You've been a Tassus today, your pushback channel, and thank you for listening.